Hello everybody, my name is John Drooney. You might know me as my online alias of Goji73 on YouTube. I figured I'd make this video as sort of a tutorial of sorts for anybody out there who wishes to make their own stop motion or Godzilla series of their own kind. Now at the time of this video, it's been weeks since I had uploaded episode 16 entitled Little Rascals of Godzilla and His Amazing Friends. And so, that's why I've sort of made this tutorial of sorts. Because, unfortunately, I have sort of been having a bit of a rougher patch to hit with as far as free time to make an episode goes. And this video is to explain what goes into an episode of Godzilla and His Amazing Friends. In this video, I will be explaining how long it takes to make an episode, how long it used to take to make an episode, as well as the 4 phases it takes in which the episode goes through towards its completion, and I will be explaining all these phases and my best advice on how to approach this if you ever want to make something of your own. This video was suggested by Super Frederick Nielsen, I hope I'm pronouncing his name correctly, as well as my friends Deadzilla and Ultraman Kronos, and I finally decided to go through with this because it's going to be a very long time before I actually post anything Godzilla and His Amazing Friends related. So I hope this entertains you, I hope this educates you, and I hope you enjoy. So anyway, let's get started. Now first off, because this part is the easiest part for me to explain, an episode at first used to take 2 to 3 months, because at the time I was just winging a lot of stuff. I just pulled out anything that interested me and decided to put an episode together. However, after some advice and watching some other famous people make their stuff, like Team 4 Star, Arby and the Chief, that sort of thing, I decided to sort of revamp how I do episodes. And as a result, this revamping of sorts now has the episodes being made usually 6 months at a time. At least so I've been keeping count as far as episodes 14, 15, and 16 go, which is the start of Season 2. And the reason it takes 6 months is because, again, due to outside work, which I can't get into detail over, as well as the phases in which the episodes go through. So, allow me to explain how the phases work when making an episode. Phase 1. Writing. The writing phase is the first part of putting an episode together of Godzilla and His Amazing Friends. Now, depending on how motivated of a person you are, the writing phase could either be the easiest or the hardest part of putting an episode together. That, as well as how much of a creative person you are, too. Essentially, it's how do you envision an episode when putting it together? How do you want it to flow? And so on and so on and so forth. And at this phase, I should mention that when you get onto the second phase, anything that you put in the writing phase can be altered at any time. Like, say, if you have a different idea in the second phase, you could easily change it in here because, in essence, this is just an idea. This is a plot line of what you want to see in an episode to begin with. I should also mention that as some advice for anybody who has an idea for their series, some really good advice that I have been hearing and noticing from some other famous people is that it's always a good idea to start from the end of an idea. Visualize how you want something of yours to end, and then move slowly but surely to the beginning of how you want something to begin. I found that to be a lot more helpful because the ending indicates what the episode was supposed to be about, and it helps me kind of visualize from that point where I want the other elements to come in from there. So, with that in mind, I actually have been able to write a bunch of episodes. I should also mention that because I am the only person that works on an episode, with a few exceptions like people who have submitted ideas for future episodes, I actually do not use storyboards to write out episodes. What I wound up doing is I wound up using a program known as WordPad, which is a very simple program that many people here might already have on their computers, and I just type out a script of sorts of what the episode is going to be. And I should also mention that while storyboards are essentially much more helpful because they better visualize how an episode is supposed to look like in your mind, and thus you put it on paper, that's also very time consuming and considering the time I have to make an episode and how long it actually takes to put an episode together, if I wound up actually using storyboards to write out ideas, it'd take a lot more time to put an episode together, and as it is, I've noticed that it's usually taking like a whole year just to get out 2 episodes, and that's really kind of hurting production. And this goes out to anybody else who has ideas for their series as well. If you're just one person working on one thing, it always helps to just type out the story essentially and then shoot it and put it together and everything else in between. That is very helpful when actually trying to visualize what you want to do with your episode. So overall, yes, the first phase is the writing phase. It's pretty much you putting your ideas on paper, and from there pretty much going into our next phase, which we are about to go into right now. Phase 2, shooting. Now, of all the phases of putting an episode together, the shooting phase is what I can only describe as the bone structure of an episode. When I'm at this phase, this is pretty much the episode in its unedited form of the episode. All the photos are raw at this point. They haven't been edited, they haven't been put together. You get the drift. It's just the photography phase of the episode, hence why I call it the bone structure of it. Now, for anybody who was listening when I was going over the phase 1 aspect of an episode, I would just like to reiterate that, once again, if you make any changes while you're taking any photographs, you have to edit them as soon as possible in the writing phase. Otherwise, the sudden changes will really slow you down when it comes to like the future phases, like photoshopping and actually putting it together. So at this phase, working in conjunction with the writing phase is very, very crucial, so that way you don't get confused when putting the episode together. So again, I would just like to reiterate that, because the funny thing is, ever since I've been using writing as part of putting an episode together, there have been some times where I've taken a few photos that I never really used in this particular phase, and I've had to go back and either delete them or move them around in accordance to not messing up storytelling. I should mention that for special effects, like I said about this phase being the bone structure, a lot of photographs are taken in order to sequence the monster's actions. Like, for example, multiple images can be taken of the monsters in awkward poses in order to demonstrate a feature that the original figure cannot do. Like, for example, in episode 16 entitled The Little Rascals, you'll see a lot of moments where Gabra actually sits down, sits up, moves his hands or arms or legs around. And as a lot of people know who actually do have the figure, the Gabra figure is completely incapable of doing that. He only has waist and arm articulation. And in order to simulate him actually having a little bit more mobility, a lot of photographs are taken in order to sequence how Gabra would actually move his arms in real life, because, as I stated before, they can't really move like that in the particular episode itself. So, in other words, I'm giving the figure special effects of sorts. So, for anybody who does use photography and wants to try this particular style that I'm using, just remember that you can pose them in awkward poses, but always remember to keep them in conjunction with the writing. Like I said before, most of Gabra's movements are just the figures in really awkward poses, just to get down how the figure is mostly immobile for the majority of the episode. As a demonstration of how awkward poses work when giving the monsters movement, here's a little sequence of a deleted scene that unfortunately didn't get made in episode 16. These particular sequences being shown right now is actually Gabra about to give Baragon a wet willy. Originally, I wanted to put this scene in the actual episode itself. However, because I was really crunching for time to get this done and submitted for G-Fest 21, I unfortunately couldn't get any time to properly fit this scene in any particular part of the episode. And unfortunately, what with the time I was losing, I had to ultimately just cut it altogether. So, as you can see here, it's mostly just Gabra's arm just moving around, and his face to look like he's simulating his tongue, whereas Baragon would most likely be altered with tiny modifications like expressions or eyes or anything like that. And as you can see, in raw form, it's just really weird, but when putting it together, it would most likely have actually looked like Gabra's giving Baragon a wet willy, but again, this is just to show off what the photos look like in raw form before they're edited in the next phase. Another thing I should mention that this episode has in conjunction with the next phase is, and this is a very important thing, is that you should always make sure that lighting is as consistent as possible. Otherwise, it creates a lot more hard work that you have to edit in the next phase. And with that, you could probably need to meddle around with your camera to make sure that the lighting is very consistent for a sequence. Otherwise, it will make a lot more work in the next phase, which we will be discussing right now. Phase 3. Photoshopping. Like I said that shooting is the bone structure of an episode, photoshopping the episode would pretty much be the muscle and or tissue of the episode in general. I should also go on record stating that of all 4 phases that goes into an episode, this particular phase is the reason why episodes take such a long time to get done in general. For anybody who wonders why it takes so long to get an episode done, this is that reason. And here is why. Every single individual frame for an episode is always keyed out, all the way to every dark corner of the monster's shadow. Everything gets keyed out at this point. This is also one of the major reasons why I don't use go motion, a technique that some people have asked that I should use, because unfortunately my OCD is why I don't go with it, because I know what I want to do with these particular figures, and while it's a little more time consuming, it's also something that I prefer to do because I'm more acquainted with it as well. I should also mention that while some people might suggest that it's just more convenient to key it out in Sony Vegas, or to use a different tool to completely key out the background, while I would be inclined to agree with those people, there is one little problem with that, and this is very prominent in episode 5 entitled A Call for Help. You'll notice that in that particular episode there actually are shadows underneath Godzilla, the Agiras, and Golza, and the reason why is because I actually used a legitimate green screen for that particular episode. And for that, I couldn't remove the shadows on the figures. They were pretty much stuck there, because I actually did use an actual chroma key in Photoshop to literally remove all of those elements to put an episode together. And while that seems good, at the same time it's not so good, because doing so also leaves a very noticeable greenish fog of sorts, or more like a green background that's not completely keyed out of the way. And like I said, I do have a very mild case of OCD, and knowing that that green is there will really bother the ever-loving heck out of me. So, as a result, because of my OCD, and because there is no other way to remove shadows or any other way to remove the background color in an efficient way that doesn't stick out like a sore thumb, every single individual frame is keyed out. Now, how is it keyed out? Well, with a little program known as Adobe Photoshop. Hence why I call this the photoshopping phase. Now, the particular program of Photoshop that I use is Adobe Photoshop CS3, and while this is a sort of outdated variation of Photoshop, I prefer to use this one because I find it a lot more easier. Now, when in Photoshop CS3, as you can see here, here is what the figure looks like when it has the background. And here is what it looks like without the background. You will see that it is just a transparent image. Starting with episode 14, this has been the norm for the series, which we'll discuss in the next phase, but for now we're still discussing Photoshop. But as you'll see, this is how the figure looks out when the background is completely removed. I should also mention that the tool in order to use this is right here on the left side. It is called the Quick Selection tool. And for a size or diameter to remove the background as efficiently as you want, I usually prefer the size 5 on it, because it gets what I want, and it even gets a lot of the small cracks that putting it at a much bigger size would usually miss out and ultimately bleed into the figure. So I definitely recommend that for anybody who wants to use Photoshop and they want to do the same technique, make friends with the Quick Selection tool, because that will definitely help out a lot. Another suggestion that a lot of people might recommend that they use is the magnetic lasso tool, which is right above the quick selection tool. Normally, I would recommend staying away from that, but the normal lasso tool is fine. I wouldn't use magnetic lasso tool because when you use that and you remove bits and pieces of the background, it makes the image a lot more sharper to a degree that kind of makes it stick out a little bit uncomfortably. So I wouldn't recommend that either. I also should mention that while the quick selection tool is very effective, it will not remove all of the background, in which case you will have to go back and you will have to use the eraser tool, which is right above the paint bucket tool and or gradient tool, whichever is selected. And with that, you'll have to go back and actually erase the shadow that is underneath the characters. And that's how you remove the background altogether. But this is how every single individual frame is keyed out, and usually the process, depending on how simple it is to remove a background on the character, it could take anywhere between 5 to 10 minutes, even 15 minutes to remove the entire background on these particular figures, which is why, again, I would like to reiterate that this is the longest phase, because it takes the most amount of time to actually remove the most important features to make the figures stick out more. So, there you go. Now also, while I'm in the photoshopping phase, I should go over one more extra thing, and that is special effects, like Godzilla's atomic ray, lasers, all that sort of stuff. For ground impacts, that's for the next phase, but for like beam attacks, like for example, here is Baragon's heat ray. This is actually much more simpler than removing the background, and for that you could use the pencil tool or the brush tool. I'd recommend using the brush tool because it makes the beam look a little bit softer, but it also resembles that of how the beams look in the actual Showa series. And that's what I use for Baragon. I just mostly use the brush tool and the eraser tool to remove any sort of excess beam effect that I don't want there. I should also mention that because this phase takes so long, if you look here in the bottom right corner, you'll notice that there are at least 80 plus images that goes into keying out the backgrounds of the characters. So for convenience sake, I actually have a big stack of Photoshop projects that are opened up, because if I were to put all of them into one project, my computer could potentially crash. So if you have a lot of photos that need to be taken out, it is okay to have multiple projects be established so that way you can work on them individually. Like for example, the ones I have opened up right now are called Trio vs. Gabara, in which Baragon blasts Gabara with his heat ray during the last time, as well as the ending of episode 16. Both of these projects carry about 80 to 90 edited photographs, as do a lot of other projects that I had to use to make episode 16. So multiple projects will happen, and I find this to be much more helpful because you can, I don't believe, with this amount of photographs that you take, you can't put into one program, otherwise your computer could potentially crash. So it's okay to break it up into sections, and plus it helps keep track of what sequences you want to work on when working in this phase. And that just about does it for Photoshop. Again, just to cover over anything, yes, every single individual frame is keyed out, hence why this takes so long. It's a good idea to make friends with the quick selection tool and the eraser tool to remove the backgrounds, and for beam attacks, I use the brush tool, as well as the eraser tool at times. And now it's time to move on to the last phase of making an episode. Phase 4. Editing. Now, in comparison to all the other phases, with the exception of writing, depending on the mood that you are in, the editing phase is the easiest part of putting an episode together. And the reason why is because you have just about everything you need to actually put the episode together already. Now, because I've described how shooting and photoshopping are in comparison to making an episode, I might as well say that editing is pretty much the skin and everything else of the episode in general, because it is the outside appearance and what makes the episode stand out rather than what goes into it. And as you might have guessed, in this particular phase, this is the phase where the music, the effects, and the layers are all added into this part of the episode. Now, because like I said, with photoshopping, I use Photoshop to actually make the photos of the episode, I use a program known as Sony Vegas 7 when putting an episode together now. In the past, it used to be Windows Movie Maker, and then after that, it used to be Pinnacle Studio 12. But after a while, Movie Maker started to become a hassle because of how limited its abilities were, and Pinnacle Studio 12's conversion quality wasn't really that up to snuff as time went on. So as a result, thanks to my friends, I was able to get a hold of Sony Vegas, and putting an episode or any project together has been a lot more smooth. To demonstrate just what a timeline in Sony Vegas looks like when putting an episode together, here is a sequence that takes place in an episode. This sequence is known as Trio vs. Gabara 3. This is when the tiny trio, Baragon, Manda, and Varan, charge at Gabara and tackle him over. Now, as you can see here, there are a lot of layers in this particular project. On count, this particular sequence has about 11 video layers and 10 audio layers. And that's a lot, even just for this one little sequence here. I know that with a lot of projects, people tend to make their episodes all at once, aka Team 4-Star has gone on record stating that they do this for their episodes. And while I can sort of understand getting it done on time, I also find this a little bit time consuming, and plus it will cause a lot of lag on your computer if you do so. So, much like I suggested for photoshopping, I would also recommend that when making a project such as this, it's best to go up into sections, because as I just stated, one section alone could have like a ton of layers that require a lot of attention to. And if you put it all at once onto one big project, it's, like I said, going to cause a lot of lag. Your computer might crash, and depending on if you're using masking or not, which I'll get to just momentarily, it just is a lot more convenient if you just break it up into sections, because I just find it a lot more easier to do things that way. Now, while I'm on the subject that I just brought up, there's another technique I tend to use when I need to in Vegas, and that technique is known as masking. Let me bring up another different sequence to give you a demonstration of what masking looks like. Here's a Sony Vegas sequence known as Trio vs. Gabara 1. This is the opening fight that takes place in episode 16. And as you can see here, right as Gabara's about to throw away Manda, you can see in the background that I didn't use an actual photograph or landscape to take the background. Instead, I actually combined two different landscapes in general. The sky is actually a still taken from the set of Godzilla's Revenge, whereas the forest in the background is that of just a plain forest, and the sky above it is actually masked out to just leave the forest alone. And in essence, I'm making my own background to give the characters depth. I should also recommend that the blur tool is also really good because it gives the character depth, like the background is being blurred because it's at a distance, whereas the character itself is in focus. That way, like I said, it gives your character depth. But anyway, getting back onto masking, this tool can be very useful depending on if you have a shot that you want to include but you don't have an actual background of it. So in essence, you can make your own, because something that you need to take into account when making an episode is how three-dimensional your landscape or background is when a monster is fighting on it. And I get a little bit nitpicky on that too. So it's a very good idea to keep in mind just how three-dimensional the landscape is in order to make your battle consistent as possible. And that's the reason why I had to use masking here, because there isn't a lot of pictures of the sets of Godzilla's Revenge that I could get in order to properly capture this scene. Now, if you want to know how to learn how to mask with Sony Vegas, I definitely recommend looking up a tutorial on YouTube. I'm sure you will find plenty of them for even some of the more recent copies of Sony Vegas. And I'm pretty sure Adobe Premiere or After Effects would also have a similar tool. And I find this particular technique very helpful for creating a 3D environment if it is necessary. Also, something else you should note about masking is that it's a very time-consuming process. Unlike the quick selection tool, every single outline of what you're masking over is going to be very time-consuming, so it's best to keep that into account as well. So be warned, it could take a long while to get it done. Now getting back onto the layers, as I mentioned before, there are a lot of layers for one short sequence. So one thing to keep in mind, especially when working with the audio of an episode, is to keep different audio levels for any different action that might take place. Like, for example, roars have to be set at a certain audio to make them more prominent. Sound effects like punching, kicking, digging, and all that, they should be at a significantly lesser audio so that way it doesn't overlaps or overshadow the monster's roars. And the music layers should also be kept at a somewhat minimal level, but not as low a level as like sound effects per se, because it's always a good idea to keep music in mind in order to keep the atmosphere consistent and prominent at the same time for making an episode. So one thing to keep in mind when working in the editing phase is to keep audio as well balanced as possible, but keep in mind what you want most prominent and what needs to be prominent in order to convey the action in an episode. Now, as for special effects, I mentioned that for dirt kick-ups as well, I do not do in Photoshop. Anything like dirt impacts, which is like dirt kicking up when a monster hits the ground or is digging away, that can be done here in Vegas, but you cannot recreate the scene. You'll have to find it on a green screening site like Detonation Films, for instance. They have some pretty good explosion and dirt kick-ups. And if you can purchase the pack, the Action Essentials, those are really, really good effects for like explosion, dirt charges, water charges, sparks, anything like that. You can easily key those out in this particular program with a chroma key effect or a screen effect in the video layer timeline, but I just find chroma key to be much more convenient. And for that, that's one of the benefits of using Vegas. You don't have to constantly add a new different special effects that's hand-drawn in Photoshop. There are some effects like explosion and dirt charges you could just key in with ease in Sony Vegas, so it's good to keep that in mind as well. And that just about does it for the editing phase. As I said before, depending on your mood when writing, the editing phase is essentially what I find the easiest because you're pretty much putting the whole thing together now at that point. So it's all just a matter of how you want the video to turn out. And so that just about does it for the behind the scenes on the series Godzilla and His Amazing Friends. I hope that this video was very helpful for anybody who plans on making their own series as well as helps people understand just how long it takes and as well as what goes into making an episode of the series as well. I hope you all enjoyed it, and I'll see you all later.